Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the War for BADAB. Things are beginning to heat up rather rapidly after Hurons seized personal control of the BADAB sector, turning it into his own personal fiefdom, raising his own personal army in the Tyrant Guard, and establishing watch bastions all throughout the BADAB sector. Having brought a period of unrivaled peace, prosperity, and stability to the autonomous zone, he now looked to growing its borders, and dispatched emissaries to the High Lords of Terror to seek support for a massive and ambitious project: the invasion of the Maelstrom Warp Storm Zone itself, and the expansion of the autonomous zone's borders. But despite Hurons' astounding record and his achievements in the autonomous zone, or some would say because of his actions, his plans were denied immediately before a full hearing was even given. And the master of the Astral Claws, and now the BADAB sector, dispatched several other emissaries with refined plans, estimates, and new ideas. All were similarly dismissed. This charade, for what other word could frankly be used to describe it, would continue on for several more years, until in 748 Millennia 41, Huron closed the autonomous zone's borders for the Imperium's tithe fleets. No longer would the autonomous zone's wealth flow out into the wider Imperium, and the reason given was that the Maelstrom warders required the resources and the produce of the zone to arm and armor themselves in its defense. Unsurprisingly, the High Lords did not take kindly to this decision, but in all due technicality, it was within Hurons' rights to do this. He was the Supreme Lord of the Warders and the Maelstrom Autonomous Zone. It was his area of operation. It was his responsibility to defend it. And again, technically speaking, the Space Marine chapters are outside of the Adeptus Administratum's purview. If Huron decided that the resources of the sector were better served arming his troops, then it was fully within his power to make that decision. What followed was essentially a 100 years long legal battle, waged over galactic distances. The one side would dispatch emissaries, citing ancient treaties, contracts, and obligations. The other side would then refuse these obligations, citing yet other ancient treaties, rights, and privileges. Even with astro-telepathic communication, it could take weeks, if not months, to receive a reply across the length and breadth of the Imperium. And considering how sensitive these negotiations were, in all due likelihood, very little of it was ever entrusted to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Meanwhile, as the legal battle raged with undiminished ferocity, Huron began to prepare himself for a different conflict. It was no mere excuse that he gave to the Adeptus Administratum when he said that he was cutting off resource shipments for his own purposes. He fully intended to make good use of the Autonomous Zone's production capacity to strengthen the Warders and the Tyrant's Legion. First and foremost, he ordered the demolition of all the palaces of the ruling class on BADAB Primaris. Any and all signs of the administration before Huron took supreme command over the system were to be removed in their entirety. In their stead, Huron would raise a massive, impenetrable palace and defensive work all at the same time. He dubbed this gargantuan construction project the Palace of Thorns. Luft Huron spent a great deal of time obsessing over every last little intricate detail in this which was to be his seat of governance. But this colossal structure that once completed would span over an area of several dozen kilometers was but one of Luft Huron's many projects. But there was one that would tower above all the others. One that in scale, ambition, and cost would utterly dwarf the Palace of Thorns. Luft Huron decreed famously that he would surround the entirety of the BADAB sector in a ring of steel. And he promised that never again would the BADAB sector be exposed to the predations of raiders, corsairs, or greenskins streaming forth from the Maelstrom warp storm. Lofty and pretty promises, no doubt, but how was this to be achieved precisely? Well, when Luft Huron mentioned a ring of steel, he was not speaking entirely figuratively. His plan was quite simply to enclose the BADAB sector with the deployment on a near unprecedented scale of orbital battle stations. It was the chapter master's eventual aspiration to place one of these massive void-born fortresses in orbit above every planet that enjoyed his direct protection. And make no mistake, an Imperial Star Fort is an imposing defensive work. With its dozens of lance batteries, torpedo silos, fighter and bomber bays, it is the equal of most fleets, and could with consummate ease see off all but the largest, most determined, and well-equipped raiding forces. Actually, even an Imperial fleet might reconsider when faced with such an obstacle. Of course, that's neither here nor there, obviously. Luft Huron was a loyal soul through and through, though his latest stunt had certainly caused him a little bit more in the way of trouble, and I speak not of his blockade of goods streaming out of the autonomous zone. I speak now of something a little bit more serious even than that. Every single Space Marine chapter is required to periodically send portions of their gene seed stock to the Adeptus Mechanicus. This is so that the adepts of the machine gods and the specialists of the Magus biologists can carry out a routine examination of the gene seed, on the lookout for any deviations, corruptions, or deterioration in the gene seed. There have been entire chapters in the past that have simply been wiped from existence because minute imperfections not caught early enough have grown. Now, in many cases, it's harmless. It might cause a few side effects here or a loss of a specific power there. But the God Emperor's gene seed is a work of astonishing complexity, a bioengineering marvel. And so in turn, when something goes wrong, it is likely to have ancillary effects. And like the good old dominoes, things can begin to collapse awfully quickly. And if sheer self-interest is not enough to encourage chapters to send in their gene seed quota, then the risk of severe and strict censor at the hands of the Inquisition usually does the job. The God Emperor's most holy Inquisition is not the most forgiving of organizations at the best of times, and they tend to take a rather drastic exception to any Space Marine chapters that may or may not be trying to hide some form of infraction by withholding their gene seed tithes. And yet, around about the same time as Luft Huron closed off the autonomous zone, regularly scheduled gene seed shipments from the Warders' chapters likewise ceased. Now, to be fair, the Warders were located within an autonomous zone, one currently a bit at odds with the wider Imperium. There could be any dozen reasons why a shipment might be lost or delayed, or that the Warders simply determined to withhold it for a period of time. No reason to ring the alarm bells just yet. And furthermore, there is no evidence that Luft Huron had any intent right now, except continuing to maintain the peace, order, and stability of the autonomous zone. In fact, within its borders, life went on precisely as normal. The Warders, when they were not constructing their extensive defensive works, were attacking the Raiders, the Corsairs, and the Greenskins. They were driving yet deeper into the Maelstrom warp storm every day, destroying new threats, piratical strongholds, and rooting out anything that might threaten the autonomous zone. But whilst it was business as usual for the Warders and for most of the populace of the autonomous zone, other places were not quite so lucky. The divide between the Adeptus Administratum, the Imperium, the Inquisition, and the Warders grew deeper day by day, as communication between the factions grew terser, more openly hostile and mocking. The tone was not helped at all either, indeed much worsened it was, in fact, by the ever more strident calls for something to be done by those who suffered the worst at the hands of the restrictions put in place by Luft Huron. For whilst the autonomous zone itself was of course booming, riding a wave of never-before-seen economic prosperity, as all of the zone's considerable produce and resources were spent within its own borders, this in turn left those who had traditionally been charged with the duty and undeniable privilege of distributing the autonomous zone's boon across the Imperium with nothing to distribute. The most immediate sufferer of this was the nearby imperial sector of Carthago. For over 1,100 years, it had carried out the solemn duty of absorbing all of the autonomous zone's riches and then parceling them out to those within the wider Imperium who needed them. And, on more than one occasion, those who could pay to skip the line. Carthago had grown mighty rich and mighty fat indeed of the labours of the autonomous zone, whilst in turn being shielded near perfectly by that very self-same zone. Carthago was not a place that was frequented by raiders or pirates or Xenos threats of any kind. In fact, as far as the Imperium goes, it might very well have been one of the most peaceful spots in the entirety of humankind's vast empire. This did not, however, mean that Carthago was weak, at least not as far as pure military presence was concerned. They were still, of course, responsible for the safeguarding of the immense treasures that flowed out of the zone. This necessitated considerable Imperial Guard forces, local PDF, and also the creation and maintenance of a vast Imperial fleet, known locally as Battle Fleet Carthago. This had, as mentioned, granted the Carthan lords considerable influence, prestige, and wealth. However, there was a catch. The ancient edicts that granted them the rights to distribute the wealth of the autonomous zone also placed upon them the responsibility to see those resources safely delivered and distributed. But of course, with no resources, no produce, no goods flowing out of the autonomous zone, that was no longer possible. However, in the view of the Segmentum Procurators General, whose job it was to ensure that all administratum tithes were paid promptly and in full, The existence or non-existence of a potential blockade somewhere outside Imperial space was none of his concern. According to the ancient edict, Carthago was to distribute the usual quantity of resources as always. The edicts made no mention, he pointed out, of where those resources may originate from. A truly exquisite view of imperial bureaucracy in action. Essentially a long line of individuals holding out their hands, waiting for them to be filled with gold, taking a portion of it for themselves and then handing it off to the next man in line, never seeing anything beyond the man that is giving them the gold and the man that they in turn are handing the gold to, caring only for the treasure that is to be handed to them and passed down the line. And so the lofty lords of Carthago could make all the excuses they wanted, and it would never change the fact that they still owed the Imperium its rightful tithe. Luft Huron had made himself a brand new set of enemies, but so far blissfully unaware of this and the other implications of his actions, the Astral Claws were riding the same high as the Autonomous Zone, having secured all of their holdings via increased garrisons of the Tyrant's Legion. The Astral Claws, the Lamenters, and the Mantis Warriors were once more freed entirely from laborious guard duty, and Luft Huron wasted no time in putting his warriors to work. There was a lot left still to do. The Autonomous Zone may be secure, but its borders were not necessarily equally stable. And there was also the situation with the Administratum to keep in mind. The Astral Claws and the Warders needed friends, allies, and acquaintances in the region, both militarily, locally, and politically. And as it just so happens, there was an excellent opportunity to gain all three nearby. Luft Huron's now very own Maelstrom-adjacent resource extraction grid was of course not the only one. There were others surrounding the very same Maelstrom, many of which were having the same problems as Huron's domain, albeit to a lesser extent. The vagaries of the warp meant there simply were not as many stable warp routes leading into these regions, and so the predictions of pirates, raiders, and corsairs bothered them less than the area defended by the warders. But as ever, external threats are not the only things that the Imperium need worry about. A rebellion had long been fermenting in the southern reaches of this particular zone, and had eventually and inevitably combusted into a full-scale separatist revolt, known as the Fourth Quadrant Rebellion. It had been going on for decades, with local forces slowly but surely gaining a grinding advantage, locking the rebels into a stalemate. The time had finally come for the Imperium to quash this nuisance once and for all, and so a general calls to arms had been issued for all nearby Astartes forces. Huron saw this as an excellent opportunity to earn the friends, the allies, and the stable borders that he required. Thusly, Luft Huron appeared on the grand balconies of the Palace of Thorns and announced that he would personally lead a large contingent of the Astral Claws to join the Imperial Task Force gathering to reclaim lost territories. He would join his own Astartes with elements of the Firehawks, White Scars, and Celestian Guards. They would be further reinforced with a massive Imperial Guard commitment by Krieg and Kolsek regiments, and finally, the Titans of Legio Venator would march alongside the superhuman warriors of the Space Marines and the men of the Imperial Guard. Before the campaign was launched, the task force would gather and discuss their disposition and their strategic objectives. When the chapter master of the Astral Claws and the lord of the BADAB sector arrived, he immediately set about deploying his considerable charms. It was his aim to ensure that the Astral Claws and the Warder's contribution to this campaign would be noted and lauded by all. And he did even better than that. Fortune followed fortune, and at the end of the conclave, Huron was appointed overall commander of the task force sent to quash the Fourth Quadrant Rebellion. It was all perfect. Whatever deity had intervened on Huron's behalf, be it sat upon a golden throne or elsewhere, the chapter master of the Astral Claws was not about to waste this opportunity. Over the course of their time in the Autonomous Zone, Huron and his Astral Claws had learned the value of speed and ferocity above everything else. An enemy crushed and obliterated would be an enemy no longer, and Huron brought all of these lessons in brutality to the Fourth Quadrant Rebellion, and within a single year he had wiped out an insurrection that had lasted for decades. When the last true strongholds of the rebels in the Lycantos system fell to the combined forces of the Imperium, it was all over. Huron had brought peace to yet another zone. And with this accomplishment, his star rose to yet greater heights and glowed ever more brightly in the Imperial firmament. But alongside great military achievements, Huron's talents for creating new enemies was not far behind either. Stibor Lazarek, the chapter master of the Firehawks, firmly believed that he should have been in command of the Imperial Task Force, both due to his position of superior seniority, and frankly, he figured he could have done a better job as well. And as befitted his chapter, the Firehawks, Stibor was also a man of some considerable temper, and he would go on to carefully nurture this particular grudge for decades to come. Meanwhile, the source of Stibor's animus, Huron, returned to the Maelstrom Autonomous Zone to an enthusiastic reception. Jubilation and general pageantry was held by one and all across the zone. Once more, the chapter master and lord of BADAB had proven his consummate tactical and strategic skill. But as any true strategist knows, it is not the victory itself that matters, it is how you use it. A truism Huron had long since taken to heart after having seen his predecessor's scheme of defending the Maelstrom Autonomous Zone fall apart over the course of decades. The Maelstrom Warders under Rovik Blake had lacked offensive spirit. The new Warders, however, were hell-bent on demonstrating that they possessed aggression aplenty. But what would be the objective? The obvious answer were the outer edges of the Maelstrom warp zones, the very depths that had been plunged again and again by the Warders and shown to be stable enough for human population. But without support from the wider Imperium, how could such a campaign possibly be launched and sustained, much less brought to a successful conclusion with the expansion of the Autonomous Zone's borders? That was a problem that the Master of BADAB had only ever so recently discovered the solution to, and so he began his preparations. Huron was about to repeat his predecessor's greatest success, the Scourge campaign. But of course, Huron was not the kind of man who would be happy with merely meeting the bar set for him by others. He wished to surpass Rovik Blake's achievements. And to do that, he engaged in a lengthy series of high-level diplomatic actions. For you see, the blockade had not only earned the Astral Claw's enemies, the way in which Huron had presented his arguments had also earned him more than a few friends as well. Huron stated that the blockade would continue because it was necessary. The Space Marine chapters under his command had been charged with the protection of the Autonomous Zone, and in so doing, the Imperium had given him carte blanche to fulfill his mission, and the resources were necessary to do just that. He was simply stating the ancient privileges afforded to every Space Marine chapter in the Imperium, the right and the duty to carry out their charter of defending humanity. There were also more than a few factions out there in the wide galaxy that enjoyed the way in which the Astral Claws spat ever so blatantly in the eyes of the Administratum. Indispensable as the services of the Adeptus Administratum undoubtedly was in keeping the Imperium running, their stiff and heavy-handed bureaucracy earned them no shortage of adversaries. And some of these were willing to stand up alongside Luft Huron and lend their spiritual support, if nothing else, to the cause of the Maelstrom Warders. Thusly, Luft Huron managed to garner the support of another, somewhat fringe force of the Adeptus Astartes for his military campaign into the Maelstrom Warpstorm Zone. A chapter that had long been at odds with both their founding legion and the wider Imperium. Indeed, at one point, they had even been viewed as overly zealous outcasts, as religious maniacs in a time that was still, by and large, one of agnostic tradition. The Black Templars. It all sounds vaguely absurd now, considering the current views of the Imperium, but once, even after the fall of the God Emperor during the Horus Heresy, the Imperium of Man still clung resolutely to the Imperial truth, and the worship of the Emperor as a god was very much so a fringe movement, only very, very slowly beginning to gain general traction and acknowledgement in wider Imperial society. The crusading Sons of Dawn were viewed almost as untouchables? Persona non grata, perhaps, would be more fitting. Their glorious lineage and association, obvious as it was to the Imperial Fists, still kept them in the relative good graces of Imperial society, but the ruling elites, and many would say perhaps even Rogal himself, harbored certain feelings of antagonism and, to a degree, superiority to these seemingly backwards religious maniacs. Oh, how times have changed. And whilst the wider Imperium may now come to view the behavior of the Black Templars as nothing more than the norm, the Templars themselves, well, the Imperial Fists have never been the most forgiving of legions, and whilst the Black Templars certainly deviate a great deal from their parent legion in many, many ways, forgiveness is not one of them. And so, when Luft Huron contacted them, resplendent in his laurels of victory after the destruction of the Fourth Quadrant Rebellion, and told them his tales of woe, how he had pushed for years for the Administratum to finally see the light and allow his expansion of the glorious Imperium of Man and the ever greater aggrandizement of him who sits on Terra, the Black Templars were not merely willing to listen, they were eager to. Here was an Emperor-given opportunity to get 2 servo skulls with 1 blessed rock. The Maelstrom Warpstorm zones in its fringes was packed thick with heretics, cultists, and deviants of all kinds. And as an added bonus, the Black Templars would also be given the opportunity to deliver a hefty helping of gene-altered piss into the favored breakfast cereal of the High Lords of Terror by siding with the Warders of the Maelstrom and bringing into reality the very plan that the High Lords had repeatedly denied. It was all just so superb. A situation sweet enough to give even the most chaste of Black Templars marshals a slight stirring in his undergarments. Deal thusly struck, Huron returned to the Autonomous Zone to begin preparations for the single largest military endeavor ever carried out by Imperial forces into the Maelstrom Warp Storm Zone. The main thrust of the advance would be led by the Black Templars, moving into the eastward marches. They had gathered a huge number of full battle brothers and a not entirely regulation standard number of neophytes as well. They would land the first blow, whilst the Lamenters, Astral Claws, and Mantis Warriors would launch their own operations out of the Autonomous Zone. The plan that had been designed to give the enemy nowhere to run but into yet another unwavering wall of Astartes power armor had been prepared by Luft Huron, and in agreeing to following it, the Black Templars honored the chapter master of the Astral Claws greatly. In return, Huron decreed that the campaign would be known by the designation chosen by the Black Templars, and thusly the Crusade of Wrath was born. And Huron's meticulous planning soon proved its value, as all the chapters involved made rapid and successful inroads into the Warp Storm Zone. Any initial fears that the effects of the storm itself might make such a campaign impossible were soon put to rest. Though, to be fair, the metal and caliber of the chapters involved may have had just as much to do with its success as Huron's careful planning. The Mantis Warriors, Lamenters, and Astral Claws had all been warring in this area for a very long time now, and they knew the enemy well. And the Black Templars, they were not one of the most famous of all the second founding chapters for nothing. They had scourged the Emperor's enemies from the face of the galaxy before the Astral Claws had even been created, and their expertise was becoming evident. The successes of the Crusade of Wrath soon eclipsed those of the Scourge campaign. Near the fringes of the Autonomous Zone, several worlds thought irreversibly lost to the vagaries of the Maelstrom Warp Storm were reclaimed and made safe by the advancing Warders. On the other side of the massive warp anomaly, the Black Templars were cutting their way into a miniature word-bearer's empire. The heretic Astartes had moved in at some point in the later stages of the Fourth Quadrant Rebellion and set up their own bases across a series of different planets. They had begun operations into Imperial space from this stronghold, where they had created a nation of the lost and the damned. Unfortunately for its new occupants, the Word-Bearers would not hold sway over their new kingdom for long, as the Black Templars took world after world, eventually cornering the last of Logar's wayward children and crushing them in their final stronghold. The Dark Sons of Dawn had humiliated one of their most hated enemies, for there is no dislikes quite so strong as that between fellow zealots, but of different causes. And in so doing, they had liberated half a dozen worlds back to the Imperium. But perhaps the single most impressive achievement throughout the entire campaign was when a combined force of Astral Claws and Mantis Warriors penetrated deeper than any Imperial force had ever done into the domain of the monstrous flesh haunters of the Howling Gyre. These twisted abominations were speculated to have once come from human stock, but at some point in the distant, long lost past, before the age of apostasy, they had become the cruel, depraved creatures they were now. They had long roamed and ravaged deep into Imperial space, abducting entire population centers worth of civilians and dragging them back home into the depths of the storm, where they would tear them apart, feast upon their flesh, and drape themselves in the gore and offal of their victims. For thousands of years, these terrifying things wrought by the storm had plagued human society. But as if sensing that their last villainous hour had finally come, the twisted horrors threw themselves at the invading warders. They bit, clawed, and scratched at them, bludgeoning, biting, and fighting against their power-armored adversaries. It took many hours of hard, bloody, gore-stained fighting until the Mantis warriors and Astral Claws buried, broke, and tore their way into the heart of the creature's largest nest monoliths, whereupon they placed down huge canisters containing the World Eater's virus. The advanced strike force deployed teleporting homers and warped themselves back into orbit after detonating the lethal canisters. Over the course of the next few hours, the vile, postulating, pulsating domain of the fresh terrors were reduced into a nutrient-rich soup, broken down by the ever-famished World Eater virus. The flesh terror monsters died screaming even as the virus devoured their lungs and ate the very breath they issued forth. The entire world was reduced to a disgusting stew of devoured flesh and blood, atmosphere filled with gases released in the dying moments of the creatures. A single lance strike from a warder's vessel in high orbit ignited a planet-covering firestorm, consigning finally the freak predators of the storm to the unforgiving pages of history. Having ended a threat that had plagued the Imperium since before anyone could really remember, Huron expected plaudits for this. He expected a recognition. He may even have hoped to see the high and mighty lords of terror realize their mistake. Oh, optimism indeed, but no recognition came. There was no sign that the wider Imperium even noticed what the Warders and the Black Templars were doing within the Warp Storm Zone. They were doing, in fact, the impossible. The crusade would grind on for quite some time yet, resulting eventually in the destruction of no less than 23 heretical and Xenos stronghold, massive fortified planets all being crushed beneath the unyielding boot of Imperial justice. Uncounted planets beyond that were also secured, and Imperial space was made safer than it had ever been at any point in history. But we all know what they say about the quiet before the storm, do we not? And events were about to be set into motion. Events that could not have been prevented by Huron, by the High Lords, by the Black Templars, or even by the God Emperor himself. Events that would tragically render many of the Warders' achievements under Huron's rule almost entirely irrelevant. And possibly even worse still. The Administratum had yet not issued any signs of support for the Maelstrom Warpstorm campaign. The Warders and the Black Templars had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, but they had not done so for free. All the chapters involved had suffered heavy attrition, and whilst the Tyrant's Legion would undoubtedly be able to take up some of the slack of guarding the territories of Garrisoning World and organizing defenses, Huron had clearly banked on intervention from other sources. There is even some indication that he may very well have received it, but that was before the coming of Hive Fleet Behemoth. Virtually overnight, in galactic and imperial terms, the Ultima Segmentum, one of the largest, strongest, and most secure segmentums in the Imperium, was placed within an inch of complete collapse and destruction by a mass invasion of an enemy that could not be reckoned with, could not be communicated with, could not be talked to, could not be placated, and whose every casualty, as long as they won the wider campaign, could simply just be redigested into their disgusting biological warships and released anew, like so much living ammunition, upon the next system they attacked. And that was merely the beginning of the bad news. Luft Huron had considered himself strong, had considered the Imperium strong, and had wished to seek to expand its borders. But now that very self-same Imperium was desperately trying to hold on to what it already had, and any ideas or hopes of expansion would have to be put on the shelves for the extended future. The Black Templars were recalled, the Imperium needed their services more desperately elsewhere, and even the oft independent-minded Sons of Dawn realized that this was not a mere abuse of administrative power. This was quite genuinely serious. It is even possible that the Warders themselves may have been called away had they not been mauled in their crusade in the Maelstrom Warpstorm zone. And besides, they would soon have problems of their own to deal with. Lacking now the support of the Black Templars, the Crusade of Wrath was effectively over. The Warders would have to think long and hard on whether they could even hold the gains that they had made, or whether they would be forced once more to consolidate within the previous bounds of the autonomous zone and admit defeat. From the highest of highs to the lowest of lows, I now bid you all adieu. You'll have to wait a little bit longer to hear the Tyrant's decision. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.